Hey everybody, this is Joel, your photo troll, and I'm here today to discuss the differences between general photography and rafting photography. So there's just a lot of vast difference between them. So as a general photographer, you're used to doing headshots and portraits and real estate and cars and children and things like that. And as a rafting photographer, you're used to doing a raft on a varyingly lit situation. So it's moving subject for rafting, still subject for almost all general photography. So that's one difference there is still subject, moving subject. Okay. So another difference is in general photography, you normally want pretty large files to get a lot of detail, and you've got room to take very large files and stuff like that. In rafting photography, you want small files. There's just so many of them that'll overwhelm your system if they're too big. And so there's another difference. Large files for general photography, small files for rafting photography. And general photography, like landscapes and things like that, you're going to edit a lot. You're going to take a huge file and bring it into Photoshop and do all this stuff to it. And with rafting photography, I do not have that luxury. I get it as good as I can in the camera and send it. So it's like lots of editing, no editing. Okay. And then in general photography, a lot of times you'll want to use a prime lens. The lens that doesn't zoom, it's just set at a fixed focal length, and you just get the best quality. Sometimes an 85 millimeter f1.4 or something. And whereas for rafting photography, you want a zoom lens. So you can zoom in on the boat as they're way up the river, and then as they make their way down, you just gradually zoom, and you just get all these photo opportunities. Whereas with a prime lens, you would just be on that piece of the river, and the raft would come through that little piece. You'd take your pictures, so you get 10 times more with a zoom. Okay. And then almost always with general photography, portraiture and landscape and things like that, you use the lowest ISO that you possibly can to get the highest quality. And that's not your first consideration with rafting. I usually use a pretty high ISO in order to have a high shutter speed, in order to eliminate motion blur and things like that. Because if you start slowing the shutter speed too far down, people start blurring in the raft, and it's just useless. So you have to stay above about a 500th of a second rafting to make it work. Whereas with general photography, you can do a 15th of a second, even a portrait, just say, okay, stand still, look at me. It's like no problem. Rafting, you got to keep it to about a 500th of a second. So slow shutter speed, fast shutter speed, okay? And then along those lines too, with general photography, you almost always use a tripod, like, food photography or portraits or anything like that. You want to be on your tripod. Landscapes, no doubt, on the tripod. And rafting photography, you're just handheld. There's the river's so rough, there's nowhere to put a tripod. There's no room for the tripod in the van. It's just not practical. And then in general photography, I notice that a lot of the times that you're close to your subject. It's like your model's right there and everything, and you can just be right there. And with rafting, the raft is up the river and it's coming down, and even at its closest, it's still 15, 20 feet away. So it starts out 100 yards away and gets 15 feet away. So near subject usually, close, far subject usually. All right, and then I think the biggest difference between rafting photography and general photography is in general photography, you want to expose exactly correctly. You don't want to be over or under. You want to be right on the money. And if anything, underexposed, so you can pull out that detail in post production. In rafting photography, you have to overexpose to get the face of the people in the boat to show up, because if you don't, they just don't show up. So rafting photography, you have to overexpose at least a third of a stop and then work your way up to a full stop, depending on how harsh the light is. And that's I think that may be one of the hardest pills for other photographers to swallow is, yeah, you got to overexpose. I think people that are used to taking skiing or snowboarding or anything like that, they know you have to overexpose to get the face to show up. So they're right on board with it, you know. And then, so with general photography, a lot of times you'll want a low angle. You'll get on your belly and you'll shoot, up at something or eye to something like that. And I find with rafting, I want to be at a high angle, and I want to look down on the boat as it comes. So the boat's coming down, and I can kind of see it coming down the slide. It's sort of what it reminds me of, is they're coming down a water slide, and you want to be sort of above them at a slight angle so you can get everyone's faces. And if you're down low, they just stack up against each other, and you can see the first people but not anyone else in the boat, really. So normally a low angle works well for general photography. That's not always the case though for portraiture. Low angle may, but usually, like, wildlife, or not wildlife, but landscape, low angle works very well. Rafting, you prefer kind of a down high angle. Okay. And then a lot of the times with creative framing, in general photography, you'll just have your subject in like the corner or along one edge, and you'll leave negative space, and you'll frame subjects just a bunch of different ways. And that's part of the real beauty of a wide angle lens and things like that, is you just have very creative framing. And with rafting photography, it's more of a set framing, like portraiture or product photography or something like that, where your subject's in the frame and it just stays in the frame. You don't do any creative, maybe a couple of creative framing out of like 100 of just like recording them going through the splash, basically. It's like almost like sports journalism to me. So anyway, general photography, creative framing's cool. Rafting photography, no, you want that set frame. And then in general photography, a lot of times you'll be able to use lights and reflectors and flashes and colored light and all this kind of stuff, so you have total control over the situation. In rafting, you are at the mercy of what's going on, and sometimes it's very difficult. It's like a bright band of light goes through, and then dark shadow, and then bright light and dark shadow, and it's like it's very difficult. Whereas and at the best of times, it's just normal daylight or overcast light's the best. So controlled lighting, not controlled lighting. And then with general photography, you can use the scene modes. Automatic mode works great. With rafting photography, I find that it's got to be manual mode. It's just the only thing that really looks good when you overexpose a little bit. I don't know. It's easier for me to shoot manual when I'm doing rafting, and a lot of times when I'm doing general photography, I'll do the scene modes. If I were doing, say, a wedding, I would use manual a lot. And I would use, because I'd be using flash, I'd set my shutter speed to a certain sync speed, to probably 125th of a second or whatever, depending. I shouldn't open that can of worms, but anyway. When you're doing general photography, you can use flash and controlled lighting. When you're doing rafting photography, nope, you don't do that. Another couple things is just when I'm doing rafting photography, I've got the high ISO noise reduction turned up to high. I've got the digital D lighting turned up to high because I'm always shooting at high ISO and I want those shadows brought up artificially, and that's what that D lighting does. General photography, I would just turn both those off because I don't want any of the artifacts or the downside of that. And I was going to say, with general photography, a lot of times you can use manual focus. Say if you're got a model that's sitting on a spot or something, you can just manually focus and zoom in and just get it just perfectly perfect, you know. And then with rafting photography, manual focus is nearly impossible, and focusing and zooming at the same time, very very difficult. So sometimes you can use manual focus with general photography, like you know, architecture and real estate, things like that. You could use manual focus if you wanted to. And you could also use focus stacking and high dynamic range and all that kind of stuff because you're on a tripod with general photography. So you can use slow shutter speeds and you can do all those high dynamic range where it needs to take a bunch of pictures and put them together, focus stacking, you know, you can do all that kind of stuff. Rafting photography, no, that's just, you don't have time for that. It's one and done, you know. So I'm just going to say, if you were coming into rafting photography and you're from bicycle racing or, you know, wolf refuge photography or something with a small moving subject that you've got to track and, you know, rattle off some pictures, it's like you will just love rafting photography. If you're into snowboarding or, you know, snowmobiles or things like that, you probably are ready to go as a rafting photographer. It's just the people that are used to portraiture and they're used to headshots and they're used to products and things like that, you're going to have a little harder transition to rafting. But anyway, I just thought I would tell you what I knew about that subject. And this is Joel, your photo troll. I'll see you down the river.